Hello everybody, welcome back to another light novel review. Today I'm talking about volume number 2 in Kumo Kagyu's light novel series, Goblin Slayer. Now in this one, in the great city that houses the temple of the god of justice, there is a problem. People are being kidnapped, murdered, and the archbishop of the temple, a woman by the name of Sword Maiden, who was once an adventurer who became so powerful she slayed a demon lord and became one of the very few top-ranked adventurers. She thinks it's goblins. And despite having adventurers in the city, she sends them into the catacombs and they don't come back. And so she decides that there's only one person who can take care of this problem. And it's the very man whose name is synonymous with the murdering of goblins, and that is Goblin Slayer. And so Goblin Slayer, Elvish Archer, Dwarven Shaman, Lizard Priest, and Priestess set off to the temple to head into the catacombs beneath the city to purge it of the goblin threat. Now this book is one big long dungeon dive. I mean, there are breaks in it. Our characters have to kind of come out of it every now and then. But unlike the first book, which sort of had a couple of missions, like a couple of adventures that they went on, this is just this one big long quest that takes up the majority of the book. We really can take a look at this series and say that there's not a lot here that's really unique in terms of the story itself. I mean, really, in some ways, it's almost like reading a long Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Even like the shoutouts to Lord of the Rings are incredibly obvious. So much so that the author even has the last title of the last chapter's title is a total shout out to Lord of the Rings. I mean, he's not trying to hide it. He knows the pedigree that this book is coming from. Even the relationship between Elvish Archer and Dwarven Shaman is really a cookie cutter taken away from what we saw between Gimli and Legolas in Lord of the Rings. This constant arguing, but at the same time, this sort of good-heartedness, good-naturedness, and appreciation of each other happening underneath it all. So with all of these elements that seem to be borrowed and cherry-picked from other places, with all of these other sort of fantasy or isekai type light novels that all have dungeons as their central idea, what is it about Goblin Slayer that seems to set it apart? Well, for me, it's two things. First of all, I'll say it's the writing. I just find the writing really decent in this series. It doesn't feel too choppy. It doesn't feel like there's just enough descriptiveness to give it atmosphere, but it's not... But it just seems more fluid, and I don't know... And again, this is where you sit there sometimes and you say, how much of this is the Japanese author? How much of this is the translator? How much of this is the English editor? So it's hard to know exactly where that sort of praise should sit, coming from a purely English reading perspective. But I will say that given how a number of other light novels don't feel that way, this one feels like it's being written by someone who has more experience, which I don't think the author does, but that's just how it feels. It reads to me like a really good fantasy novel, and a fantasy novel that is being handled by someone who at least has some idea of what they're doing when it comes to writing a book. It doesn't feel amateurish to me. And again, I think a lot of this is just personal taste and perspective, so some of you may disagree with me, but just given the light novels that I have read, I just find the writing in this one really seems to draw me in and doesn't seem to jar me out of the story as much as some light novels do. But I think the most important thing that makes this book work, and the thing that I enjoy the most, are the characters. Now, I've already said that we have Elvish Archer and Dwarven Shaman, very similar to Lord of the Ring counterparts. Even Lizard Priest, that third wheel, the very sort of logical, spiritual individual, again, harkens back to sort of the third wheel of Lord of the Rings. But what makes it work is these two characters, Goblin Slayer and Priestess. And I think that, and I don't know how much of that is intentional on the author's part, or whether, he just was like, I really just have to have a really cute, wide-eyed, blue-haired, blonde-haired girl in this. But it works really, really well because you have this girl on the one side of the spectrum who is all heart, who's very innocent, and who sees through to sort of the actual goodness and the underlying intentions of people. When Elvish Archer and Dwarven Shaman begin to bicker, Priestess giggles to herself because she sees that these two actually have a very deep respect and appreciation for each other, and yet they're just constantly at odds with each other. With Goblin Slayer, she is the perfect foil for Goblin Slayer because she is so much about emotion and about heart, and Goblin Slayer is so much about logic and the process and accomplishing the goal. And it is these two characters placed sort of bookending our other trio. It just makes for a really good blend to me in terms of characters. And the other thing that I really like is that Goblin Slayer himself is just a very different main character. It's struck a really good balance between that cold, single-minded, traumatized by my past kind of main character, but he still walks that line where he's not a dick. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes people go overboard with that and you're just like, I hate this dude. I don't even care if the main character dies because he's a jerk. And then other times he's too wishy-washy and you're like, okay, I don't buy it. I don't buy what you're trying to tell me, that he's this hardened dude and yet, he's like a big teddy bear. Goblin Slayer himself as a character seems to walk that really perfect line where you can see that at heart he's a good man. You can see that in his mind he is doing the right thing, but that he has that single-minded devotion because of his traumas that it makes it hard for others to relate to him. And part of the fun of this book to me is to see how these characters deal with him and to see the characters sort of giving each other these knowing smiles that, yep, that's just him. It's cool. We know what he really means. And also to see a little bit of the break in Goblin Slayer's shell. I said this at the end of the first volume that, we had gone from this character who was very, very hard and determined to remain solo and alone, and that by the end he had actually started to gain an appreciation of having help. And in this one, that continues. The character continues his growth in that way. And it's really gratifying as a reader that they didn't try to reset it too hard, that, let's just reset him back to what he was at the beginning of book one and then we'll just build him up again. No, the progression of the character feels natural. The progression of the character feels organic. And it really works. And I like the fact that they have struck a really good balance in this series about characters that are strong and powerful, but not OP. Like Goblin Slayer himself, he's not overpowered as a main character. He's just very smart. And not even that he's really smart. In fact, sometimes in the book they even make the case that maybe he ain't the brightest bulb in the whole place, but because he has been so devoted to this one cause, his knowledge and his skill are basically without question. And it's not to say that he doesn't get his ass kicked. He does, which, again, gratifying as a reader to see a main character who can fail, but yet also will stand up and keep going. And also how the magic system, that it's based on like these prayers, and that you can only do them maybe 3 or 4 times in a day. It adds this very real limitation to the power of the magic users. And because of that, there's all this strategy involved with don't do that. When they have conversations even where they know that they're probably going into something dangerous, and it's like, okay, how many spells, like how many miracles do you have left? And they're strategizing this way. It makes the book, well, like I said, it really does make it like you're part of sort of this campaign, this Dungeons and Dragons campaign with your characters who have their set stats and have so much, casts of per spell, and you have to strategize in order to succeed. And I really appreciate that this isn't a character who is just muscling his way through things. He is having to use his head. And he's relying on the abilities and skills of every single person in his party to make those things work. It isn't just about him. Like, yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing, too, is that, well, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but I think the other thing, too, that works in this book is that this whole idea of psychological trauma. And we see it very much in Goblin Slayer, and we do see it in other characters. This lingering fear and anger and, guilt and everything else. And it seems legit. Like, it's not just words on a paper that the author decided he wanted to use to describe the character. No, the characters live those things. And for me, I think that's really why I say, like, it is the characters that make this series. Yes, I find the writing really well done. Yes, there's lots of action, and it's cool to see how they figure their way out of the jams that they get into. And yes, there's like a good story sort of on top of all of this that brings it all together and makes it work. I really, I'm sure you can tell by now, but I really, really enjoyed Goblin Slayer #2 just as much as, if not a little bit more, I would say, than Goblin Slayer #1. And I think really it's because because we don't have to meet these characters all over again, because they are established. We have that relationship happening and developing right from the first page, and it really works so well that I think that's why I like this one a little bit better even than Goblin Slayer #1. So, Goblin Slayer #2, those are my thoughts. A really good book. Wow, really becoming really one of my favorite series. And because I just finished something that was becoming one of my favorite series, I'm going to do one that is one of my favorite series, and that's going to be volume #4 of Overlord. It just came out this week, and I had plans to read Excel World #9, because, 8 left on a cliffhanger, but Overlord, man, I can't, knowing that it's out, I can't leave it. Gotta read it. Overlord #4, that will be my next review. So, you know what? If you enjoyed this review, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you want to pick up your own copy of Goblin Slayer 2, I've got a link down in the description for that for Amazon. It does net the channel a couple of pennies, which always does help. If you're brand new here, don't forget to subscribe so you can check out all of my future light novel reviews. I really appreciate you guys joining me in this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Till then, bye-bye for now.